Hi everyone, my name is Marie-Therese Png and I'm a PhD candidate at the Oxford Internet Institute, a DeepMind scholar and previously technology advisor to the UN Secretary General's Digital Cooperation Office. This paper anchors AI governance to the power dynamics between the global north and the global south and takes a systemic, historic and post-colonial approach. It is a review and synthesis of available literature on critical discourses from the global south that mainstreamed discussions on AI governance tend to ignore, but are key to ensuring that AI technologies are safer, more equitable, and more sustainable. These critical discourses include concerns of digital sovereignty as relevant to the context of low and middle-income countries, infrastructural and regulatory monopolies, and AI industry regulatory capture, harms associated with the labor and material supply chains of AI technologies, and commercial exploitation, including beta testing of AI technologies on traditionally marginalized populations. The objective of this paper is to offer arguments for the restructuring of AI governance processes in order to move beyond current approaches of inclusive AI governance or AI for good. It identifies that often inclusive AI governance approaches exhibit what Cleaver describes as the paradox of participation, wherein inclusion can exist while structural harms persist. In response, this paper offers insights for how AI governance processes can be restructured to more comprehensively mitigate structural harms from AI systems at the social and geopolitical levels. The proposed steps advanced by this paper to restructure AI governance are threefold. One, to identify mechanisms and protocols that mitigate the aforementioned paradoxes of participation in ways that redress institutional barriers to global south participation. Two, to co-construct and formalize roles with global south actors to ensure their effective engagement in AI governance processes. And three, to engage in a historic and geopolitical power analysis of structural inequality in AI governance and surrounding international legal frameworks. On the second point, this paper proposes three roles for global south actors to engage in and improve on the ability of AI governance processes to effectively mitigate harms. These include challenging exclusionary governance mechanisms to shift the distribution of agenda setting, resource allocation, and decision-making power, providing legitimate expertise on the interpretation of risks in ways that are locally relevant, and providing a source of alternative governance mechanisms. Mechanisms discussed in the paper include South-South geopolitical solidarity, co-governance, democratic accountability structures, and leveraging a growing political economy of resistance around AI harms. On the third point, critical global south discourses bring the understanding that present-day structural harms are outcomes of, quoting Bambara and de Souza Santos, the structural processes of dispossession, enslavement, appropriation, and extraction central to the emergence of the modern world. This paper observes a historic amnesia in mainstream international AI governance, which limits the understanding and ability to mitigate present-day AI harms. To illustrate this paper uses the framework of coloniality, which is the socioeconomic, political, and cultural structure that survives colonialism, and recasts the popular AI governance narrative of the Fourth Industrial Revolution in a historic light. In doing so, it highlights that the First Industrial Revolution relied in part on the dispossession of land, violent exploitation of people's labor, extraction of knowledge and natural resource from European colonies, and to the present day, their strategic underdevelopment. With this perspective, it becomes clearer why the Fourth Industrial Revolution still relies on the exploitation of labor from ghost workers who annotate data, for example, the exploitation of electronic waste workers who break down hardware components of AI physical infrastructure, the mass extraction and monetization of data from the global south, and the extraction of mineral resources required to build the physical components of technology infrastructures upon which AI systems are developed. To summarize, this paper presents types of relevant structural harms discussed in the global south that most discussions on AI governance in the global north tend to ignore. The paradox of participation, where an exclusion can exist in governance processes while structural harms persist. That in order for AI governance processes to more comprehensively mitigate structural harms from AI systems at the social and geopolitical levels, these processes need to be restructured. This paper therefore proposes three roles for global South actors to substantively engage in AI governance processes in order to have agenda setting, resource allocation, and decision-making power, and proposes that mainstream international AI governance needs to address its historic amnesia regarding present-day legacies of colonialism in the unequal distribution of risks and benefits of AI systems. Thank you very much.